Greetings to all, and thank you for joining us as we discuss diversity, equity, and inclusion in energy. The agenda for today is highlighted on the screen before you. I will give the introductions of the panel and present a brief commentary on why DEI. Nathan Shannon will present on the SECC's Racial Disparity Report, and then we will open the floor to the panel for an open discussion. If you have any questions, ask at any time and we'll get to them at the end. So let's start with the formal introductions. My name is Andronika Wissington. I am the Regional Partner Diversity Lead at CLEAResult. I've been with the company for 7 years now, primarily within program delivery, in which DEI was a significant part of my strategy for successful implementation. Prior to coming to CLEAResult, I was the workforce director for the largest community action agency in the Chicagoland territory, which gave me firsthand knowledge on the importance of community engagement to affect change. I am honored to be here moderating a panel of distinguished colleagues in the energy efficiency industry. First, I would like to introduce Nathan Shannon. Nathan is Smart Energy Consumer Collaborative President and CEO, and he leads the organization's research, membership, and policy initiatives. He came on as SECC's Deputy Director in early 2015, and in this role, he grew the membership almost 50% to over 160 members. Along with his work on the research and policy committees, Nathan leads member recruitment and engagement and routinely presents SECC's research at major industry conferences and policy workshops around the country. Next, we have Monica Martinez. Monica is a former public service commissioner who has dedicated her career on climate change, limited income customers, and DEI advancement in energy. She currently serves as principal at Rubin Strategy Group and as consultant with MLC. Both are based in Lansing, Michigan. Finally, on the panel, we have Sylvester Johnson. Sylvester is the Director of Supplier Diversity with CLEAResult. He's a dynamic leader with over 25 years of multifunctional experience. Prior to joining CLEAResult, he spent his entire career with The Home Depot, where he held a variety of leadership roles. He developed an effective supplier diversity strategy to raise awareness, engage business partners, and he implemented a mentoring program to assist with the growth and development of small and diverse businesses. He has served on the board of directors for the National Minority Supplier Development Council, the Georgia Minority Supplier Development Council, and the Women's Business Enterprise National Council. Thank you to all of our panelists. So let's dive in. Let's dive into the main question. Why DEI? Why DEI, you ask? My grandmother used to say that it is rude to answer a question with a question. So I warn you, I'm about to be rude and ask, why not? It's impossible for me to narrow the benefits of DEI to just 1 or 2 slides. There are numerous benefits, but in short, DEI breeds creativity, innovation, and an enhanced sense of belonging and engagement for everyone. If put into action, it means you're better representing what the world looks like and your customer base. Taking note of the recent social climate and spotlight on racial justice and equality, many businesses and industries have taken a renewed interest in diversity, equity, and inclusion within their own organizations and the surrounding communities that they serve. But for these efforts to truly be successful, there must be acceptance from all of us. You see, DEI doesn't just happen. It has to be intentional. It has to be embedded within your purpose. It has to be given the opportunity to prosper. But without actively embedding it in our strategies to use less energy, we won't be able to solve the sustainability challenges that we face. And believe me, we have a long way to go to close the gap. So what are we seeing in the industry that is driving these conversations? Well, the data is there and the numbers don't lie. Low-income households spend 3 times more of their income on energy costs than non-low-income households. Low-income, rural, Black, brown communities are more likely to live and work in energy inefficient buildings and less likely to be able to access resources that can help them save on energy costs. You simply can't ignore that these marginalized groups are disproportionately affected by the impacts of climate change. To elaborate more, I would like to introduce Nathan Shannon to talk about his research on racial disparities in energy. Nathan?
Thank you, Antonika. Yeah, just to piggyback on that, that's what I'm going to talk a little bit about today, is sharing some data that backs up what Antonika was saying. There's many data sources that talk about the disparities between racial groups among lower income consumers, and I'm going to share some key findings on that today, and then we can use some of that in our discussion. But just as a quick background on Smart Energy Consumer Collaborative, we're a nonprofit organization that was formed in 2010, and we are focused on delivering consumers' values, perceptions, and motivations through our primary consumer research. The idea is to help those of us in the energy industry really understand why consumers make the decisions they do, what's the best messaging that works when it comes to communicating the values of efficiency or different programs being offered to customers. And so we put together 5 or 6 reports each year to deliver those the consumer voices to those of us in the industry. We are a membership organization. We're made up mainly of energy providers, the utilities out suppliers and the vendors such as CLEAResult there, but we also bring together the support who work with utilities on these different customer engagement programs. And then we also bring in the regulators, the PSCs, the PUCs, as well as the consumer advocates who work in the energy space. So the idea is to bring everyone who is working in the energy industry together to have a seat at the table when working on this consumer research. Next slide. So the study that I want to talk to you today go to the next slide, Emily. Might be a little bit of a lag here. Perfect, there we go. So the study I want to talk to you today about started with a series of low-income research that we did in 2021. It was how to best serve lower-income customers. And what we found in the research is that there were some big differences between different races of customers who we surveyed. And this particular survey was of 1,000 Americans. And so what we decided to do was put together a separate report on the racial disparities among lower-income energy consumers. And the report highlights the differences between white, Black, and people of color households around energy-related issues, their concerns, their behaviors, and their interest in different programs and technologies. And as a side note, everyone on today's webinar will get a copy of this report, of the full report. You can access it in the handheld or the handouts sidebar in your toolbar on the side here, so everyone can look at the full report after this. Next slide. So this slide goes over the 5 main findings of the research that I'll move through briefly today, and we can have a deeper discussion in our Q&A. Overall, people of color do have greater financial household struggles. They have higher energy burdens, as Antonika mentioned, and typically they're living in homes that are less energy efficient. They're also more likely to rent, so their options are limited when it comes to having control of their energy usage or making their homes more energy efficient. Secondly, COVID has had a much higher impact on households of color. They've been forced to make difficult financial decisions and have a much higher concern with being able to afford their monthly household utilities. Next, people of color, especially Black people, prioritize the environment more than other consumers. This was one of the more surprising findings because there's typically been a myth that lower income consumers are less concerned with the environment. These consumers do have concerns that weigh heavily and maybe more heavily than the environment, but it doesn't mean that sustainability and clean energy aren't important to them. And often these consumers live in areas that are much more disproportionately affected by poor air quality and natural disasters. And according to our research, they're making the connection between clean energy and mitigating those issues. Next, their value for the environment is also linked to an increased interest in smart energy technologies. People of color have a stronger interest in smart energy technologies and are more willing to share access to their data to a third party to get the benefits of these technologies. And then lastly, people of color face more barriers to using energy efficiency assistance programs. And part of this is due to the upfront cost barrier, as well as the fact that most of these consumers do not own their own home. Next slide. So this slide goes into some details on the ways that COVID has affected households in America. We asked consumers in what ways COVID affected their lives, particularly negative ways that affected their lives. And we saw that 8% of white households said that it created a difficulty in paying their energy bills. But for Black households, that number was also four times as high, almost 4 times as high at 33%. And we're seeing it come in at 26% for people of color with difficulty paying their electricity bill. Next slide. So how can electricity providers help in mitigating these issues? Offering less expensive rate plans or such as time of use rates, peak time savings plans, peak time rebates seems to be the top way providers can help all underserved consumers. This had the most interest when we talked to all customers in the lower income segment. We also saw a need for education on how to reduce energy usage. So any tips or tools that you can provide customers on how to help them with any behavioral changes within their home to help them save energy will be well received by all these customers in the low income segment. We also saw a higher percentage of Black people and people of color who are in need of a bill deferment or payment option plans. That's another way that they've expressed need during the past 2 years over COVID. Next slide. And as I mentioned earlier, people of color, especially Black people, are more likely to prioritize the environment and be concerned about pollution. They're also much more interested in smart energy technologies, but we do see that upfront cost as a barrier to adoption with these technologies. One of the things I want to highlight on this chart is that Black people and people of color put much more emphasis on environmental concerns when it comes to deciding who to vote for in elected office. They also place a higher importance on their energy coming from a clean source. They have a real concern with where their energy comes from, and we're willing to do more research to see if it does come from a clean source. Next slide. Another area that we tested was the smart energy technology interest. The technologies that we tested in this particular survey were smart thermostats, smart appliances, smart lighting, rooftop and community solar, smart leak protection, surge protection, and overall technology to help manage energy within your home. And with each of these technologies, we're seeing a much higher interest rate from Black households and people of color, sometimes almost double the interest when looking at compared to white households. This interest creates a great opportunity for energy providers to engage customers with a multitude of offerings and programs. There definitely will need to be a good bit of education on how these programs and technologies will be used to save money. So, talking about a return on investment and tangible results is very important to customers. And there also will be the issue of overcoming the barrier of upfront cost. But with some partnerships and some rebate programs, there are ways to overcome that barrier. Next slide. So I also want to talk about leave you with a few next steps and takeaways. First, energy assistance programs should always be targeted to the challenges faced by people of color. Since most of these consumers do rent, assistance programs need to incorporate landlords, and understand what works well for renters and a shared dwelling in order to be successful. And secondly, the barriers such as the upfront costs and lack of information need to be broken down to improve adoption of energy efficiency programs and increase usage of smart energy technology. Assistance in these areas needs to address these barriers by developing specific pilot programs with incentives or rebates to help reduce cost. Also, local organizations can help play a role in socializing these programs within the community. And then lastly, speaking of partnerships, these partnerships should be developed with community organizations, landlords, and technology companies to help deliver some successful programs. And as I mentioned earlier, landlords are such an important partner due to the high number of renters in the low-income communities. Also, the community organizations and governmental partnerships are crucial. These are central places of engagement and the places that people go to look for information on assistance programs. We also need to start including the technology companies in the effort to reduce costs. And many companies already have stepped up and played a role in this. There's many smart energy and smart technology companies who have assistance programs that have initiatives specifically targeted to serve under-resourced communities. So those are just a couple suggestions from the research that we felt would be a good next steps and takeaways. The main idea behind the research was to understand who these consumers are and their values and preferences, and how now the next step is to understand what we need to do to deliver these types of programs to customers and make sure the messaging is personalized. So I'd be happy to answer more questions in detail about this research and others that we're working on as we move into the discussion portion. So I'll turn it back over to Angelika.
Thank you, Nathan. Thanks for sharing your research highlights with us all. Now we'll transition to our roundtable discussion. So my first question to the panel regarding Nathan's research, and Nathan, of course, you are part of the question as well with Sylvester and Monica, is if there was anything specifically that resonated with you from the research and the report that was just provided that you would like to either expound on or even add to.
I think I'll jump in. Oh, go ahead. Do you want to go, Sylvester?
No, ladies first.
Okay. I think, it just reiterated what I always knew growing up as a child, right? La tierra, the earth, everything that we were taught, even my grandparents, they had their plot of land in their backyard where they would grow vegetables, right? We believed in the earth and we believed in sound, and it just emphasized, yes, Latinos, we care about the planet. We care about Earth. You can't grow your plants if the weather isn't conducive for that to happen. And that was a means. So to me, it just reiterated what I think many of us have known all along, and sort of debunked those myths that may have been out there about how our communities perceive and believe in terms of climate and environment, and what we feel that we've been living and hearing all along. And I think it underscores one of those big issues. It's about access. And like many other things with access, if we cannot access the tools to make it happen, if our communities cannot afford the high efficiency wash machine, it becomes that much more difficult. If people live paycheck to paycheck, there's a lot of things going on there. But to me, it was underscoring a lot of things that, I'm sure like many of you are like, okay, we've lived and breathed this, we grew up like this. So that was a piece. Go ahead, Sylvester, I'll let you go in now.
No, I definitely agree. I think the challenges that plagues, our communities, people of color, there's a definite correlation, on the business sense as well. So as we think about, suppliers of colors and partners of color and people of color who start businesses, right, their challenge, similarly, in terms of the struggles associated with growing or education. And again, you can pick an industry. It's not just specific to energy, right? So, access to capital, any facet of this world, people of color are challenged with level setting or being on a level playing field. And so I think Andronika touched on it in her opening comments, is that the intentions to right that wrong or to fix that or to level that playing field is something that should be important to all of us.
Yeah, one of the things that we really saw come out of, not only was it debunking some myths about lack of environmental concern, but specifically really making the connection between slowing climate change, cleaner energy, how it affects the environment, how their everyday decisions affect the environment. We really saw the consumer taking this survey, take time and think about these questions and about what their role was. We did some, in this survey, we did some, what was called implicit association testing, and it tests how long a consumer spends on a question, what time they put into it. And we really saw around the environmental questions and they're making that connection there. They really are taking more time on those, and that is something that's of great importance to them, and making the connection between the pollution and poor air quality, maybe in the areas they live, or the natural disasters, things like that. They are wanting, they're expecting their energy providers to play a really strong role in that, but they are also wanting to be empowered to play a role. So I think it's up to the providers to provide some sort of pathway for consumers to be empowered in that conversation. We all hear about the decarbonization goals that cities and states and our electricity provider may have, but how do we actually get involved in that? And we saw a lot of consumers in this survey in particular, and all low-income consumers really, not just on the racial disparities, but in all the low-income research on how they are wanting to be involved in that and play a role. So I think that's the next step, is really how to get them involved.
For all three of you all for responding to that. One of the things I heard specifically when we're talking about debunking or dispelling the myth of people of color just simply not interested in, smart technologies or what have you. And Monica, you mentioned, like, we were raised with our grandparents that were growing, vegetables in the backyard, and we really cared about the earth. And for me, I've had multiple conversations throughout the energy industry with different people from utilities, community-based organizations, and it's really interesting. And Nathan, you mentioned it was surprising to see that people of color care. Why do you think that that myth is out there? And what do you think can be done to help change that narrative?
I personally think the myth is out there because we have the assumption that a lower income household has, their priorities are more on the survival side of things, of just filling your basic needs. But the environmental issues is part of your basic need. And I think people have overlooked that and saw that your basic need is just, paying your rent, paying your utilities. But there's an underlying component that having clean air quality, and as you mentioned, Monica, and if you're growing things in the ground, having that environmental quality is part of a basic need. And so somehow making that connection for folks out there to understand that it's not just paying your everyday bills, there's other components that make up your everyday needs, and that I think has eluded or has contributed to this myth of lower income consumers not caring as much.
Yeah, I mean, I agree. And I think it goes along with the lack of resources as well, right? I mean, oftentimes, well, it's a reality that, people of color in low income communities don't have the resources to, do the energy efficiency upgrades. And so therefore there's a misconception that they don't care because they don't have the resources to, to make those changes.
I agree with all of that, because I think it really is, and especially in lower income communities, there's probably, as you mentioned, like a competing interest where food on the table is essential, but at the same time, so is the environment. And in some communities where you don't have to worry about the food on the table, that it's just a given, there's not this competing interest. And so it's the lack of caring myth is, equated to what may be seen as whether or not they've already had access to it. I think that's really what the core is. How do we guarantee and make sure we're doing a better job on creating access, because clearly it's wanted.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and part of that is where that access is coming from. There, in our research and others that I've seen, there are oftentimes lower income consumers don't always have the most positive attitude towards their energy provider. Their energy provider is sometimes seen as a bill collector to them. That's, if they need to contact their electricity provider, it's usually not a positive experience. So the need for partnerships with local community organizations, just like you were saying, Angelika, that is meeting them where they are, and with the organizations, whether it's faith-based organizations, whatever it may be, the organizations they trust and the community leaders they trust are the ones that could help bring in some of that, whether it's efficiency education or ways to get involved on clean energy goals, things like that. Sometimes directly from the utility might not be the person or the entity that they want to hear from, just from negative experiences in the past. I think it's definitely up to a lot of partnerships are needed. And Chicago has done great with that. And where you were talking about, Angelika, I think there's some great partnerships with the community organizations there, and the utilities within Chicago have known or have seen that need early on. That's what I've noticed as far as the cities that have noticed that.
Yeah, Nathan, and that's a great point. And I would agree. I wholeheartedly agree. I mean, based off of my own experience, there's a lack of trust, when dealing with the utility in the inner city communities that are struggling. And yet, when we are talking to them and we're coming at a place through the community action agencies or community-based organizations or churches, there's a more a feeling of trust that, okay, these people are here to help us, and not necessarily a one-time hit, so that's the thing about it. It has to be an ongoing situation where you're developing that trust and they know that they can count on you for, other things. And sometimes we have to think outside the box, sometimes maybe around Thanksgiving we need to do a turkey drive. This isn't about energy efficiency, but maybe we can put some food on someone's table, to just continue to gain the trust so that we can continue to educate those in need. But I do believe that those collaborations and partnerships are key, and in order for us to affect real change. Sylvester, speaking of partnerships, you also mentioned, just standing up these small businesses that are struggling in the communities. As far as DEI is concerned, what are the things that you're seeing that is either, hurdles that the small businesses have to go through that others aren't having to, that you can maybe address and share with the panel?
Yeah, I think Nathan touched on it a bit in his information, and it all starts with the barriers that really prohibit Black and brown companies from either excelling or advancing or even getting business. Right there's so much required of a company who doesn't have the resources that larger companies have, and again, a lot of those barriers are just some people just chalk them up as the cost of doing business or, specific business requirements. But when you look at smaller companies that don't have the resources to either, get their insurance requirements or, even just really business processes as such as lead times, right? Companies don't have enough resources to float payroll from month to month. So it's making sure that as larger organizations like CLEAResult and others, we come up with ways to really assist small companies so that they can advance and excel and get the scale necessary to become a company who can stand on its own. Because a lot of companies have started so far behind that it's tough to catch up, right? And so we can't have expectations, and that assistance is definitely necessary, right? And there has to be mandates in place for you to make that happen, right? So I think, as we talk about, again, I made this point earlier, it's not just energy efficiency. You pick an industry, you pick a scenario, you pick a cause, right? People of color are significantly behind in a lot of cases. And so we have to make sure that we're intentional with putting these things in place so that we can take these businesses to the next level, because we're doing so much to contribute back to these communities that that we want to help, that we want to see grow. And so they'll have the resources to make these energy efficiency, upgrades and improvements to their homes. And, this problem goes away. And so we're not having this discussion 10 or 15, 20 years from now.
Yeah, it's often the small businesses are sort of the forgotten middle in the energy community. We talk a good bit about the residential customers, and we know a lot about the big C&I guys. They have their own account managers. We know a lot about those folks, what they need, what they're interested in. But that small medium business component is really the forgotten middle, and they're hard to reach because they're often treated like a residential customer, especially on the very small side, but they have much different needs, as Sylvester was saying, and I think reaching them is part of a difficult part. But one of the interesting programs that I saw a couple of years ago, and I think it's still going on, is at Pacific Gas and Electric. They were doing a best business rate program, and they basically were proactively reaching out to all the small businesses in their territory and offering a rate analysis and giving them options on different time of use rates that could be of use to them based on their behavior and based on their energy usage. And really, I just thought it was very proactive of them. It started with a small business forum of inviting small businesses in to talk about their issues and needs, so sort of a small focus group. But then it turned into this best business rate program, which seemed like a good low-hanging fruit. Rate design is can be a low-hanging fruit based on what type of company it is and when they're most using power, and seeing if we can get a plan that would be more beneficial to them. That was just one recent one that I've seen that seemed to work pretty well.
Those are all great points about the forgotten group of small businesses. Thank you all for sharing that. Before we go into the Q&A, I did want to ask Nathan specifically because of the research that he provided. Were there any additional research that you and your team have already started to look upon when it comes to equity conversations that you can possibly share, just out of curiosity, what else is happening on your end on the forefront?
Yeah. Once we really started to dive into this racial disparities conversation, starting this 2021 report, we started to include DEI as a component into all of our research, starting at the end of 2021, continuing through 2022 for our upcoming projects. And in particular, there's two studies that we did. We did a smart home study. Since we saw it in this study I just talked about, that we are seeing a really high interest from lower income consumers, specifically Black and people of color, in interest in smart energy technology. We did a deep dive into 5 different smart home devices and how those looked at what type of programs consumers would be most interested in, how they would want those programs set up, what types of rebates are they looking for, is there a certain upfront cost they can afford. So we did a deep dive into that, and then we also did a look into achieving equity among electric vehicles because we saw a pretty decent interest among lower income consumers in electric vehicles. And that's another myth that sort of is out there, is that electric vehicles are only for the rich, and they're actually quite efficient and very low maintenance cost. And there's a lot of used electric vehicles that are out there that are available to consumers that would actually be a better long-term return on investment than combustion vehicles. So we do have those 2 recent studies that have that equity component concluded in them, mainly to look into consumer interest around those technologies. And we have an event. We actually do have an event coming up in May where we'll be presenting those studies. It's in conjunction with Distributech. So happy to get anyone signed up if they're interested in attending the event and kind of diving in a little deeper into those studies.
Certainly don't want to rob Monica and Sylvester from chiming in if you have some thoughts on, the smart home study in EV world.
Yeah, I was going to tell Nathan that it's definitely a myth that you have to be rich to drive an EV, because I drive one and I'm hardly so.
That's the old perception though. People just think it's just a bunch of Teslas running around out there. It's like, that's not the only option. Even Tesla's coming out with a lot more affordable options too, but there's so many others that are out there. It's changing constantly on what the available options are and charging infrastructure. And the one area that we did see still concern was charging infrastructure for renters. That is something that needs to be addressed with landlords and multifamily property owners. Having access to charging is still a really of high concern to lower income consumers when it comes to buying an electric vehicle, but we're seeing more and more of that be addressed, and that taking more initiative, especially with recent governmental doctrines and things like that that have come out that have encouraged more EV usage. So hopefully see that progress in a positive way.
I think that myth can easily be debunked soon, because specifically here in my area, I believe the EV world knows that Black people are spending money in electric vehicles, because I was driving and I saw in a predominantly Black neighborhood an EV charging station pop up, and I was like very impressed by it. And I'm like, wow, this is predominantly Black and it's an EV charging station. So yeah, we're going to turn that around pretty soon. So I do want to say we're at the 20-minute mark, where we supposed to have question and answers, Q&A from the audience. So if we have any available, let's go there for the panel.
First question is, how can program managers identify the best community partners to work with? What should we be looking for in an organization?
You want me to take that one? I mean, I think, it definitely requires spending time in the community, getting a sense of what those businesses' reputation is in the community, right? And again, I think that's the best way to really find out, or to increase your comfortability with the businesses in the actual communities, or within the programs.
Yeah, who would they look towards as a long-term energy advisor? I mean, Andronika, you probably, as you in your work with community organizations, I know that you probably could answer this better, but it's the organizations or the businesses that have that reputation and longevity within the community that can produce and also be a part of other initiatives within the community. Maybe it's not just around energy, like you mentioned before, whether it's food drives or other things. That creates that trust over time, and then you also can implement some energy efficiency and advice and things like that throughout that relationship that you build. So it's just Sylvester said the same thing, that long-term relationship, who has that within the community?
I agree, Nathan. And, as a program manager, it's important for you to know your territory, and when you know your territory, you become intimately involved with the community-based organizations that are doing things in the community. They have other drives. It's not necessarily going to be about EE, but, and actively participate, volunteer, those are the things that really resonate with the community, so sometimes you have unnecessary things that happen, or unfortunate things that happen, tragedies where a multi-unit building burned down, and then you'll see on the news like they're doing a clothing drive or something to help out. That's where you take the initiative and you go and plant yourself to see how you can be of some assistance. And you connect with those community-based organizations, and it grows organically from those types of things. But you have to know your territory and you have to be involved. Otherwise, it's going to be a hard time trying to get in and get their trust. That will be my suggestion as a program manager. Know your territory.
I guarantee you, if an organization did an EV test drive day, you'd get a lot of people out there. That would definitely drive some interest. If you can tell people you can come out and drive some EVs around.
I agree with
people
that.
out there, that might be a good initial way to get your name out there, is do a test drive day. you'll see a lot of people show up.
I would just emphasize, think outside of the box. Sometimes we get stuck into the energy paradigm or the low income paradigm. And it's, recognizing community partners that are from all places. And I think we can think outside of the box and be willing to establish that relationship. And I think that Andronika really hits on what you're talking about. It's not just one time, it's just not periodic. It's actually having that investment and that relationship so that they know it's real.
Question. Thanks for answering, panel. Any more for us?
Yes, there's one specifically for Nathan, and the question says, was there interest expressed in long-term, low-interest financing tools for making energy efficiency investments that aren't relying on high FICO credit scores to qualify?
Yes, we did ask about on-bill finance tools, things like that. One of the suggestions and one of the things that I've seen work well is the PAYS program, Pay As You Save, and some cooperatives have started to adopt this. I haven't seen, there might be a few IOUs that have adopted the PAYS program, but it basically is an on-bill tariff that goes with the home. And it's for efficiency upgrades, and there's no credit check, there's no initial investment. You only will pay as much as the energy savings that are in your home. So basically there's an audit of your home, what you will save on the efficiency of the upgrades. Determines what your tariff will be, and then when that payment is paid off, or that improvement is paid off, it drops off, but it stays with the home, not the consumer. That was one of the programs that seemed to be most interesting to customers when we presented that as an option. Just like you said, there's not a need for a high credit score or initial upfront cost. There are a few other models that are similar to that, but any way to avoid that credit and upfront costs seem to be the most interesting to customers. I believe it was on the slide. There was a slide earlier that I had up on interest in how their energy provider could help, and their top one came in at different rate designs and dynamic rates, things like that, and education. But a few down from there was interest in financing efficiency and how that would work. So it is a pretty high interest. I believe it was over 30% for the lower income consumers who said they'd be interested in a program like that.
Thank you, Nathan. Another question that came in is regarding small businesses that we just briefly touched on earlier in the roundtable. And the question says, what specifically is CLEAResult doing to increase small businesses that are providers to the programs you support?
That is a great question. CLEAResult has added resources to their supply diversity program, myself being included. I recently joined CLEAResult I want to say about 4 months ago. And we actually added some regional support as well. Andronika is leading our central region. We also have a regional lead in the Eastern and also in the Western division as well. We actually just communicated a strategy to leadership that includes being more embedded, definitely in the communities to assist with growing and developing small businesses, right? I talked about some of the barriers that plague small businesses earlier. It's finding ways to assist them better with some of those barriers so that they can actually grow their business and become, larger businesses in the community, so that they can actually, start hiring, more people from the community and create that economic impact within the communities that they serve. So we have a laundry list of things that we're just scratching the surface on. And a lot of those things really include will really be centered around growing and developing small businesses. How can we partner better? How can we, align with some of those regional needs, some of the utility needs, and partnering with the utilities to make sure that we're, being intentional about growing these companies.
The next question says, in your experience conducting research Do you find any difference in response rates between different groups in terms of income level, race, or other demographics? Any best practices on reaching different groups in order to capture their voice?
For me, for our organization, our response rates, we have to get to match the U.S. demographics, as far as the U.S. Census demographics. So we will continue to do surveys until we get enough completes to meet each of those demographics. So we have seen lower response rates with lower income consumers. Sometimes that can due just to time constraints. As we mentioned before, there are other priorities, maybe that they are not able to participate in a survey. There are times that we've offered incentives for our survey takers. And also it really, one of the main ways that we're able to reach lower income consumers is to have a multitude of ways to reach out to them. So sometimes it can't always just be a digital survey through email or online. It might need to be a phone survey. Sometimes we've held focus groups, or even an online forum seems to help. It gives folks a time to come in and have a conversation online at their own convenience. So having kind of a hybrid, multi-pronged approach to how you're reaching out seems to be the most beneficial. Particularly, I would say the hardest demographic to reach is the lower income senior population. That is a group that it usually takes our longest to get our survey completes from that group. But having that multi-pronged approach helps us get to the number of completes we need.
Well, I don't do a lot of research. I do know based off of some experience, not specifically to response rates, but as far as best practices and how to get responses from different demographics. You mentioned the seniors. Again, this is just my research based off of my experience. I've learned that they prefer like the old school snail mail. You can't necessarily reach them through, a phone call, a survey, or online. They're not dealing with that as much, but they'll fill out the paperwork and put it in an envelope and send it back to you. So that's their form of communication that they will prefer as far as a medium. But I do think that based off of the type of demographic, you can adjust how you will communicate for surveys. They're getting real savvy right now, with everyone has a smartphone. You're doing the QR codes that you put on, or, fix it on certain things so that you can quickly get, some information. But again, it's geared toward, the age of the person you're trying to survey, the race, the just nationality across the board. And also you want to make sure that you create different literature in different languages. We seem to be stuck with English and Spanish, and then that's that. Well, we have a Polish speaking population that you need to address, and so forth. So that's another way as far as the best practice to make sure that you are addressing all the constituents in your community. And again,
also,
that's more your territory. Go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say also the education portion, when you mentioned the different languages, having a really strong education component to the survey is so important. Writing a survey that is easy for everyone to understand. You cannot assume that someone knows what a time of use rate is or what demand charge is. Like, you have to make sure that this is at a level that the average consumer can understand it, and you provide educational components to help them along through that survey. It's particularly with online surveys, it's great to add in little videos or infographics as they fill out the online survey to educate them on available programs or services. Otherwise, if someone's not aware of something and they're always going to say, no, I'm not interested, or next, or not applicable. So having the education component is really crucial. And it's funny that you actually mentioned snail mail. That was the only way we were able to get survey completes from small, medium businesses. Businesses preferred to just receive something in the mail, because then it could get to the correct person who makes those energy decisions. Because if you call a business, you don't know if that's going to be the person who is making energy decisions within that business, or if you email them or do an online survey. So mail seemed to work great for the small businesses as well.
Interesting.
We only have time for a couple more questions, so I will do my best here. And thank you everyone for submitting your questions. We've had quite a few that have come in and we really appreciate it. We know that DEI is a very broad topic and we're only covering a part of it today, like Andronika said earlier. One question that just came in says, what are your thoughts on language barriers? You all just touched on this briefly, but this person specifically is asking, saying we are looking into translating our forums into Spanish, but we realize we don't have the staff to do that. As a result, we have been slow to roll out this effort. Is that approach okay and better than doing nothing, or do we need to have that language available on all interactions to make it successful?
I think language barrier, is a major problem. I mean, we have to make sure that we're doing enough on language access. And, one is recognizing, what the language barrier is. There are many times people go into a community and make an assumption and think, if I go in, kind of like what Adrianica has already mentioned, English and Spanish, they're all set. Coming from Michigan, we have, a very large Arabic community. And if we were not producing, our messages and our information in Arabic as well, we would be losing out on a major population. And that goes for just all different kinds of communities. And it's not just to limit it to those, but I think is recognizing what is the barrier. And what can we do to help overcome that? And there are many different services that can help, even on a contract basis, to help you get and produce and publish forms and information that are probably easier to reach and access than you probably think. And then also figuring out other mechanisms, especially if it is verbal, and how we can access that with other forms and other information. So I think those are all key. And then I'll also go back to making sure that we're speaking in plain English as well, because sometimes we can get caught into this. And I think Nathan touched on this. We start talking about things and we're so far ahead. So that's what I would say on language access.
And if you don't have the staff to do it, there's a host of small businesses out there that offer that service. So definitely tap into them.
Yeah, and if it's
Monica,
for,
you go ahead, Nathan. Sorry.
I was going to say, if it's for something as far as community benefit around energy, there's also community organizations that will help with that if there's not budget to translate. If it's something around energy, which is a benefit for everyone, that they would probably assist with that.
And I would say, to that, Nathan, have them check it over, even if you do contract it out. There are cultural nuances and, areas that, people think one is all the same. And so, once you do something, use those community partners to help vet it after it's done, to give that second eye.
Yeah.
That's such an excellent point, Monica. You mentioned Arabic. I know that there's so many different ways to communicate within that in that particular language. And so having another set of eyes specific to different communities is necessary. So yes, that's key. Great feedback on that. So I see that we've put here for more information and we have 3 minutes remaining. Before I start reading that off, did you all want to do a different question or should we just end it here?
I think we have time for one more question.
Go for it.
We'll use the maximize everyone's time here. I just wanted to make sure everyone had the information on the screen in case they wanted to jump off early, but we hope that you won't. Another question says, are you working with any organization who can help provide financial assistance to save families, or excuse me, to save energy to low-income families?
I was gonna say, well, for SCCC doesn't work directly with customers. So like our focus is to understand consumers and then deliver to the energy industry what consumers are saying and what they need. So for me, we don't work directly with the consumer or work with the organizations who are assisting customers, so I can't be of much assistance in that one. I have examples of programs that are successful and things like that, but we don't directly work with them.
So that's to Nathan's point, you know, it's an effort that's designed around a lot of different individuals working together. So we partner with people that are actually assisting individuals, whether it's through some of the federally assisted programs like the weatherization program or LIHEAP, which is for low income heating and assistance. So we partner with them to make sure that we're able to help those that are getting assistance for low income, if that makes sense. So we do partner, we just don't directly work with them.
Yeah, I mean, our organization partners, we are with the Coalition to Keep Michigan Warm. And so we have an abundance of members, community action agencies for one, and other organizations that do directly help. But again, it's a partnership and an association where everyone's doing their piece to help the community.
Well, I do want to thank, I see we're at 1 minute in. I want to thank Nathan, Sylvester, and Monica for this great discussion. DEI is way too much to talk about, so this is just a small little portion. And I didn't get a chance to read those, the links before, but we'll post this out and send this deck out to you all to contact us. For more information about the CLEAResult webinars, you can visit CLEAResult, www.clearesult.com. For Nathan's report for the Racial Disparities White Paper, it was also included in this chat here, but you can go to smartenergycc.org/research. And if you have any questions or an idea for a future topic, please let us know and email us at brand@clearresult.com. That's all I have for you. Thank you all for your time.
Thank you.
Thank you.